Disclaimer: I do not own DC Comics or their properties, nor is this video a substitute for reading these stories. Despite my critiques, all books shown in this video are worth buying and reading. So Dark Crisis, the latest epic DC crossover event, just finished, and with it comes more changes to the DC Comics universe. To those who are familiar with said universe, DC has had many stories and events that alter and retcon its continuity in order to keep things fresh and alive. Now, the benefit of having such a detailed continuity is that all comics made by DC are connected in some way, from 1938's Action Comics number 1 to 2023's Action Comics 1051. One could link these stories to each other. More than 80 years of storytelling, all connected. The only issue with this is that the linkage between all these stories can be complicated. In fact, the DC Comics universe is infamous for focusing on its always changing continuity, especially compared to, say, Marvel. However, in DC's defense, Marvel has their complex continuity issues with many of their big characters. Looking at you, Spider-Man, and X-Men. So why is this important to know as a DC Comics reader? Well, it is and it isn't. While it may be cool to know the technical stuff, it's not completely essential, because the most important thing about any story is the story, not just the connections to the larger picture. However, the retcons and reboots and the other timey-wimey stuff does make for a good story in itself, especially on a large, epic scale, and it helps connect and bring the universe together, making it feel like one large story. Plus, if one understands the timeline of the DC universe, they can also understand the history of DC as a company, as many of these big stories and events reflect what directions and status quos DC wanted to pursue at the time. Knowing what reboots and retcons that took place can also be handy when reading the backlog of most characters. Examples. Why is Wally West the Flash in the pre-New 52 era, but doesn't come back until DC Rebirth? Or, why is Jason Todd Robin's origin so different pre- and post-Crisis? So on and so forth. Also, DC keeps bringing this shit up anyway, and there has been at least 6 major DC events in the last 10 years. Lastly, to know why this is essential knowledge, this is one of the few topics in my life that I have encyclopedic knowledge of, and thus, my purpose in life is to share this lore with you. Now, my goal for this video is to help newer readers get into this amazing world of DC that has treated me so well over the years. Spoiler alert. While I don't go into too much detail, I will explain how these stories changed the DC universe, so be advised. Now, you should still read these stories either way if you like DC Comics, but nevertheless, spoiler alert for the comics listed here. As seen here, these are the major stories and events that have influenced the DC canon the most. I was originally going to orally elaborate on what this all means, but this stuff is too damn abstract to understand. So, I drew up some sketches to illustrate what's going on here. We start off with Earth 2 and Earth 1. Earth 2 encapsulates the Golden Age of comics, and Earth 1, the Silver Age, aka the Justice Society live here, and the Justice League lives here. There will be many interactions between these two worlds and teams. However, as time goes on, this becomes more complicated, as more alternate timelines would come about and interact with the main story. Now, as you can see here, it gets quite messy, and the average reader could not follow what counts, what's important, what's not important, what's mainstream, what's just a one-off. It just wasn't a good look. This brings us to our first event, Crisis on Infinite Earths. This would streamline the universe and combine Earths 1, 2, and a few others into one timeline, a new Earth. However, jamming all those timelines had the consequence of some plot holes and inconsistencies, as seen here. So, 0 Hour, Crisis in Time, cleaned up the timeline and established a more consistent series of events. In Infinite Crisis, the multiverse is almost restored by the bad guys, only to return for real in the 52 miniseries, creating a multiverse of 52 Earths. Yeah, the number 52 will come up quite often after this point. Flashpoint reboots the universe entirely, making the heroes younger and with less history, thus the new 52 in a prime Earth. Various timelines and stories that were cut down before a proper conclusion were brought together and are allowed to exist simultaneously with the universe, in DC's Convergence. Thanks to a returning character, the DC Universe learns that its continuity and timeline were messed with during the Flashpoint, and things start to return to the pre-New 52 days in DC Rebirth. At the conclusion of Dark Knight's death metal, all characters in universe remember everything, so all stories now count and the timeline is back to normal. And now, thanks to Dark Crisis on Infinite Earths, the infinite multiverse is restored. Now everything ever made by DC, including movies, TV shows, games, etc., are all canon in their own world. Everything counts in some way or another. That is the skinny of all the major DC events. Now, if you feel satisfied with that explanation, I wish to not waste any more of your time. You're free to go. However, if you want further explanation per each point I've made, stick around, as that is what the rest of the video is about. Our journey starts in the golden age of comics, the late 30s and 40s, with the first appearances of Superman, Batman, Wonder Woman, and many other DC icons. Comic books were a new commodity back then, and were thriving, especially due to them being propaganda of World War II. This era saw the rise of other heroes, such as the Green Lantern Alan Scott and the Flash Jay Garrick. Their names will be important later on. The Justice Society of America would be this world's main superhero team. However, World War II would end, and the superhero comics would also fall into somewhat obscurity, as the demand for them dropped in the post-war, ending the golden age of comic books. This, however, would not be the end of this world and their heroes, as we shall see. Years later, superheroes would come back into popularity and start the Silver Age. In fact, the book that started the Silver Age was the first appearance of the new Flash, Barry Allen. Even though these stories featured Batman, Superman, and Wonder Woman, this would actually be a different world and different timeline than the Golden Age, as showed by the different Flash and Green Lantern, now Hal Jordan. The heroes of this world would form the Justice League of America, the Teen Titans, the Outsiders, the Legion of Superheroes, and many other various teams of the sort. The acknowledgement of this being a different world came to be when in Flash of Two Worlds, Barry Allen would travel to the Golden Age world and meet Jay Garrick, the debut of the multiverse. After that, there would be many different meetups of characters of these two worlds, and various team-ups between the JSA and the JLA. The Silver Age mainstream Earth would be called Earth 1, and the Golden Age, Earth 2. As the years would go on, there would be many different Earths of alternate timelines, all offering wild and different stories. So many that it became too much for readers to keep track of, and it just became a mess. On top of that, DC had come into possession of a few publications, such as Fawcett, Charlton, and Quality Comics. It was decided by the heads of DC that things needed to be streamlined and simplified for the ease of reading. This plan led to the iconic miniseries Crisis on Infinite Earths, an event so great, so epic, many consider to be the gold standard of superhero events. Long story short, the multiverse is under threat of being destroyed, as many Earths in the multiverse are being swallowed by antimatter in a chain of events accidentally sent by Pariah. The Monitor, a being who studies the multiverse, summons the heroes of the remaining Earths to come together and defeat the all-powerful Anti-Monitor and save their worlds from oblivion. During this event, we are introduced to Superboy Prime, Alexander Luthor of Earth 3, and Superman Earth 2 comes back as well. After many heroic sacrifices, the Anti-Monitor is defeated, and the remaining Earths, Earths 1, 2, 4, S, and X, are combined to form New Earth, and their histories and heroes are now intertwined in the same timeline. Here is a visual representation of the formation of New Earth in the wake of Crisis. Earths 4, S, and X are notable because they represent comic publishers that DC had acquired and wanted to absorb into their universe. If not for this, we wouldn't have the Peacemaker show, or Shazam, or Watchmen, as example, and so on. Earth 2 Superman, Superboy Prime, and Alexander Luthor of Earth 3 would then go live in a pocket dimension afterwards. They'll be important later on. But all stories after this event would be called post-crisis. However, the merging of a singular timeline did have its complications. Most of the heroes were given brand new origin stories. We got Batman Year One and Superman Man of Steel as example, and Wonder Woman would be relaunched entirely. The main superheroes were years into their career by the time of Crisis happening in this timeline, except for Wonder Woman, which leads to complications, especially when considering that Donna Troy existed for years and was a Titan for years, while Wonder Woman would just be starting off. That would be the equivalent of Robin existing for 5 years while Batman's just now starting out. That and Hawkman's, existence are examples of the plot holes and issues with the timeline as it stood. So in 1994, DC released Zero Hour, Crisis in Time, to fix these issues and serve as a spiritual sequel to the original Crisis. In fact, for every 10 or odd years, DC will make an event comic that involves a crisis, which, hey, helps buff out my video. The summary of the event is the timeline itself is under attack by the villains Extant and Parallax. That's all I'm going to say, because I won't go into too much detail, due to the convoluted nature of the story needing outside material to understand. The main purpose of Zero Hour is to give DC a stable timeline of events, as well as establishes the concept of how time affects its stories. What that means is that DC now has a sliding timeline. And a sliding timeline, to explain it simply, is basically if you look at this timeline here, you'll see that certain events take place on a specific date, 1935, 1940, 41, 42, specific set in stone dates. And some of these events take place X years ago. See here, we have 35 years ago, 30 years ago, 15, 11 years ago, relative to when the story takes place or when the reader is reading the story. That way we have the JSA definitely getting involved in World War II, but that doesn't restrict the characters of, I don't know, Batman or Green Arrow's origin to be strictly related to the Cold War. Like that can be flexible, but the JSA's origin has to be World War II. Hence, sliding timeline. Now, time is now a means for storytelling. Since the multiverse is gone, we have alternate timelines. We have this thing called hypertime, where the timeline itself is like a river, and hypertime represents all these little streams that come out of it, which of course represent the alternate timelines of things that are slightly different and that will lead to a different outcome, which makes for an interesting and fun story, like Superman Red Sun or Kingdom Come, for example. But now that the timeline is stabilized, this led to, whether indirectly or directly, some miniseries would come out to explore some stories that now take place in the past. An example of this would be The Long Halloween and its sequel, Dark Victory. And on top of that, all superhero titles at this time would now get a zero issue, which would just give a cleaner, more updated origin story for each and every character. For example, we know if you read Batman Year One, you see Catwoman when she starts off, she is a prostitute. But in the Catwoman Zero issue, you can see that she has a much more explored and defined origin besides just a prostitute that Batman comes across in his first year. All right, now we get into the good stuff. Fast forward to 2005. The world of DC has become dark, edgy, and worst of all, just not fun. Just before this event, heroes were not acting like heroes. Unfortunately, this has been something that's been going on all in the early 2000s. Members of the Justice League, they brainwashed Batman to make him forget him seeing them do something unethical, which of course leaves Batman to be paranoid of everyone, even his loved ones. Beloved superheroes like the Blue Beetle are violently killed and unceremoniously murdered in cold blood. In fact, Wonder Woman kills a man on live TV. All in all, just a general mood of distrust and despair, which I guess you could argue is appropriate for the early 2000s. And before I go further, a little fun fact, this here is my favorite comic book event, period. The story of Infinite Crisis is that Superman of Earth 2, Superboy Prime, and Alexander Luthor of Earth 3. They come back, and they're not happy with the state of the DC world. So they break out of their dimension and come back in to bring back the multiverse in order to get their perfect world back. I mean, just in the beginning of the story, when they break out of their little dimensional world there are already continuity changes being made. In fact, you look at this picture when Superboy Prime is breaking out of reality. If you look at the shards of the glass, you can see the retcons and the changes in the timeline that are made. And probably the biggest one that impacts the most is this punch is what brings Jason Todd back to life, which is appropriate because at the time of the story, the Red Hood story was being released. Now, their efforts to restore the multiverse lead to destruction, much death, and themes of toxic nostalgia. I will not try to give away the whole story here, but obviously, they lose. And the multiverse does not return, since its return would bring the destruction of New Earth. However, in the 52 weekly series that followed Infinite Crisis, Booster Gold would actually help to restore the multiverse. This new multiverse would consist of, 52 Earths, with Earth 0 being, New Earth, the main Earth. A whole new infrastructure would be developed and explored upon by Grant Morrison, with each Earth separated by the bleed and kept within the source wall. The orrery and its map would be heavily referenced in future multiverse stories. And this new multiverse would include the Earth 1 comics, Superman Red Sun, the Crime Syndicate team, Marvel similar look-alike characters, the Batman Beyond story, New Frontier, as well as those Fawcett, Charlton, and Quality Comics I mentioned before. And each Earth would have a monitor of its own to, monitor them. Instead of only having one monitor for the infinite multiverse, we have one monitor for each Earth. And in fact, stories like Countdown and Final Crisis would actually explore this new multiverse. However, since Final Crisis doesn't technically change DC in a continuity sense, I will not delve into it. I just want to mention it here so people, don't get confused if they ever see something called Crisis, and talk about it. I don't want people thinking I forgot about it out of ignorance. I am choosing to acknowledge it here, and don't get me wrong, these stories do impact the universe quite heavily so, just not where I'm going to talk about it here. Now, what does change the continuity in the timeline is, of course, Flashpoint, for better or for worse. Because Flashpoint is the end of the New Earth story that started all the way back in Crisis, because it reboots the entire timeline. Luckily, thanks to the animated adaptation and the CW Flash show, Flashpoint is probably the most well-known story in this entire video. But, in case you don't know, the story begins just after Barry Allen goes back in time to save his mom from getting murdered. This change causes all sorts of things to go wrong in the timeline. Like, Bruce Wayne's parents actually survive the mugging, it's Bruce Wayne getting killed. Themyscira and Atlantis, they go to war. And little baby Superman, when he lands on Earth, he unfortunately lands in Metropolis, in the city, destroying it, killing millions. Yeah, the world of Flashpoint would actually be brought back a few times due to the popularity of the setting. In fact, their version of Batman, Thomas Wayne, would also pop up all throughout the future. Fans really just like the idea of a timeline where everything goes to hell. How cathartic. Now, like all the other stories I mentioned before, the good guys obviously win, and Barry goes back in time to stop himself from saving his mom. Now, when he does so, he is met by the entity known as Pandora, who claims that long ago that the DC, Wildstorm, and Vertigo universes were separated in order to weaken them all for a future invader. Just so you know, the Vertigo universe includes heroes like Swamp Thing and Hellraiser and Animal Man, while the Wildstorm universe has the Wildcats and Apollo and Midnighter. Also, all these characters have crossed over with the main DC universe at some point or another, so this wouldn't be the first time interacting with each other. Now, this explanation that Pandora gives, that these worlds were weakened by someone separating them for a future invader, that will never be brought up again. That is the explanation she only gives here in this story. However, the mixing of these worlds and the alteration of the timeline Why that happened will be explored later on, but in any case, this is the moment she merges the three of them together, these three universes together, and subtracted 10 years of history from the timeline. And thus we get Prime Earth. However, Prime Earth is really just a fancy name for the New 52, which is what most people know this time to be known as. The idea of the New 52 was meant to be a reboot to attract newer readers into the DC comics. The thought was that with the lack of years worth of backstories and all the titles restarted to issue 1, readers would have an easy jump on point now that this is a new and non-intimidating comic world. Now, on paper, this is a great idea. Fresh stories with our favorite characters, very good artwork, just a world of possibility. I mean, hell, Marvel did something very similar back in the early 2000s with the Ultimates universe, and that was a major success. This, of course, was nowhere near as good as Ultimates, unfortunately. I mean, at least with the Ultimates, that was an alternate timeline. So readers, if they didn't like a title, they could just go read a story in the regular Marvel timeline, the regular Marvel universe, and be satisfied there. That was not the case here because the New 52 was all of DC. Like, the reboot was entire, and unfortunately also botched bad. Now, don't get me wrong, when the relaunch began, they were financially making success. However, after like a year or so, their numbers dropped. The problems actually stem from the edgy, dark mood that we were talking about earlier, confusing story decisions, and a lack of unity behind the scenes. Now, when the New 52 starts, the Justice League is the first superhero team, meaning no JSA, no legacy heroes to look up to, which is reflected on the douchey nature of our heroes. A prime example of this is unfortunately the Superman presented in the Justice League comics, and it is fully explored, the douchiness, I mean, in the comic book Red Hood and the Outlaws. The Teen Titans would have just been starting off, founded by Red Robin. Or did they? There was a team referenced by Starfire that involved some of the older Titans. Maybe that was a time hiccup and not a mess up on the editors. In this time, superheroes have existed for 5 years, although Batman has 10 years. So the writers can mention pre-52 events at will in order to help flesh out their stories. Now, this obviously goes against the nature of a brand new start, as this would require previous reading of a different timeline to understand a current and newer timeline. Alienates new readers. And the worst offenders of this were with Green Lantern and Batman. The majority of the Jeff Johns Green Lantern run apparently happened in this continuity. So in 5 years, the Green Lantern Corps had Hal Jordan, Guy Gardner, John Stewart, Kyle Rayner, Simon Baz, and all sorts of different colored Lantern Corps. In the 10 years that Batman has existed, he's had all of his villains, Dick Grayson, Jason Todd, Tim Drake, Damian Wayne, all as Robins, and Barbara Gordon as the only Batgirl. The only Batgirl. So Stephanie Brown and Cassandra Cain don't exist, but all the other Robins do. Now, Dick would, at this point in the story, when the New 52 starts, he would have had his career as Nightwing and even as Batman when Bruce was presumed dead previously. Jason Todd at this time had died as Robin and came back to life and became Red Hood, as we know him. Now, Tim Drake has only been Red Robin, despite the fact that many fans claim him to be the best Robin, period. They only make him Red Robin. And they made Damian Wayne born within Batman's career. So, how would a 12-year-old boy be born within a 10-year period of time? They had to accelerate his growth in a lab like he's a clone trooper from Star Wars. You know what I mean? They had to alter his origin slightly just to make it fit in this timeline. And then we get to Barbara Gordon, who was shot and crippled by the Joker, just like pre-52, but she got better. She healed from being paralyzed. So instead of, working from a wheelchair and being Oracle, she's out in the street being Batgirl again. Many fans would claim this to be an ableist decision, may or may not agree with that. But all in all, Just with the Batman stuff alone, the following stories count in the New 52. Man Who Laughs, Death in the Family, Killing Joke, Under the Red Hood, all of Grant Morrison's run, so Batman Inc. and Battle for the Cowl also exist. All that stuff happened in 10 years of time. And Superman didn't get off scot-free either. We have Superman titles taking place in the current day and Action Comics in the past. The two writing teams weren't sure about the living status of Ma and Pa Kent, a pretty large thing to get wrong. These decisions came from a lack of foresight and planning from the editors and the higher-ups. I won't get into the bullshit going on behind the scenes. Better men than me comic tropes. I've covered it. What's important to know is that the New 52 failed and DC knew it. They could not deny they knew the New 52 was a mistake. In 2015, DC made Convergence, a finale to the Earth 2 story at the time, that also served as a proper send-off to all the stories that ended abruptly with each passing crises and retcon mentioned prior. While the main series delved into the Earth 2 stuff, the many tie-ins focused on giving their respective characters a fitting conclusion. These tie-ins would focus on comic series from before the first crisis, before Zero Hour, before and even during the Flashpoint event. And these tie-ins were beloved by the fans of their respective series, some of them even fixing issues made within the series, such as Leon Harper's death from the Titans comics before the New 52. The most important comic from this is the Superman tie-ins, as they follow the post-crisis Superman and Lois Lane as she gives birth to their son, John Kent. As the event ends, they would be transported to Earth Prime as the New 52 begins, as a retcon. The aftermath of this event is a little puzzling, however. Each timeline aforementioned now exists simultaneously with the New 52, although not much would come from it except for the post-crisis Superman. This means that their respective multiverses also exist too, even though the main multiverse is still only the 52 Earths. To this day, not much is really set in stone for what this event meant, except for that the New 52 title is gone, replaced by the DCYou. Stories would then focus less on continuity and more on new concepts, with the status quo being changed, albeit temporarily. Superman would lose his powers, the role of Batman would go to Jim Gordon, and so on. One title that did remain in the status quo was Justice League, as they were going through the Darkseid War arc, whose ramifications will be explored later on. All in all, the DCU would be a temporary change, as DC was preparing for the next big thing. DC would release two excellent miniseries and a crossover to hype up the next main event. Superman, Lois, and Clark would deal with how the new Kent family, from the aforementioned Convergence tie-ins, deal with John Kent's new powers as well as adjust to the New 52 world. As a result of Darkseid War and the finale of other titles, Superman of the main New 52 Earth would learn that he is dying, and what follows is shown in the final days of Superman. In Titans Hunt, Grayson, Donna Troy, Arsenal, and other former Titans would come together and discover that 1. They were, in fact, Titans, 2. Someone had made them forget that they were Titans, and 3. That aside from the original Dove, there had been another Titan missing in action. All of these stories would lead us right into DC Rebirth, a single-issue event that serves as an apology for the New 52, a love letter to DC fans, and a promise for a hopeful future. I would argue that this is the last high point of DC Comics to date, as high as DC gets, as it were. The story is this. That missing Titan from Titans Hunt? That was actually Wally West from pre-New 52, and he has been written out of existence and memory of everyone in this timeline. Wally has been stuck in the Speed Force since Flashpoint, but luckily he was able to break out thanks to the events of Darkseid War. The story shows Wally West trying to get his loved ones to remember him, and as he does so, his presence allows for things to start to resemble his timeline, aka Green Arrow and Black Canary getting together, like they did way back when. Barry Allen remembers him, and brings him to Prime Earth, and Wally West tells him that during the Flashpoint, someone stole 10 years from the timeline to weaken it, later revealed to be Dr. Manhattan of The Watchmen. Batman and the Flash would try to track him down in later stories, as well as Flashpoint Batman joining this universe. With the return of Wally West in the DC universe, things begin to revert to the way things were before the New 52. like minor older characters being canon again, such like Ma Gunn from the older Batman comics. Many characters' costumes resembled a more classic look, i.e., Dick Grayson is 1, he's Nightwing again, and 2, he has a blue costume, not red. Red Robin actually looks like Robin from the 90s, with the red and green design. Green Arrow would have his classic goatee again, and Kyle Rayner would be a Green Lantern, once again. However, it was the story Superman Reborn that marked a point where the pre- and post-New 52 timelines would start to merge. The story ends with Mr. Mxyzptlk combining the Earth Prime Superman and the New Earth Superman, and thus combining both their life events and histories into one singular Superman. His history is altered as a result, especially with the birth of John Kent being in the Fortress of Solitude instead of Convergence. This story indirectly allows writers to call back to older events as the current story sees fit. An example of this can be seen in the Dark Knight's Metal event, with that story being a nexus for a lot of continuity and callbacks to prior stories in the DC universe. This event features the first appearance of the Dark Multiverse and the Batman Who Laughs, and ends with the destruction of the Source Wall, which is the physical boundaries of the multiverse. This leads to the rise of beings of high power that control everything in the multiverse, such as Perpetua. This will be important as we go along. Sometime after the events of DC Rebirth, Doomsday Clock takes place. This story serves as a sequel to Watchmen and a crossover with the main DC universe. It is here that we learn what Dr. Manhattan did to harm the DC timeline. When Dr. Manhattan comes to the DC universe after Watchmen, he witnesses the debut of Superman in the 1930s. Then he witnesses it again, and again, and again, as he becomes familiar with the sliding timeline of the DC universe. He also sees the link between Alan Scott becoming Green Lantern, him forming the JSA inspiring the Kents inspiring Clark to become Superboy, and Superboy becoming the reason why the Legion of Superheroes is formed, and all this leads to the universe becoming heroic, even before the Justice League forms. In a moment of universal weakness, thanks to Flashpoint, Dr. Manhattan goes back in time to prevent Alan Scott from becoming Green Lantern, and now, because of that one moment in time, the universe is now darker, and thus we have the New 52. There is no JSA, there is no Legion to inspire Superman or the Justice League before the League became a thing. Doomsday Clock would end with Dr. Manhattan undoing his interference, and now the JSA and the Legion exist on Prime Earth. At this point, even though all these characters are available to the stories, the timeline and history of these characters are still unchanged from the New 52, for now. Dark Knight's death metal would be the culmination of all of the DC Rebirth storylines. In this story, the Batman Who Laughs has control over the entirety of the DC universe, and the heroes need to face impossible odds to fix everything. After a long and convoluted struggle, Wonder Woman defeats the Batman Who Laughs, and for a time has that infinite power for herself. With this, she makes everyone in the universe remember their entire past, pre-52, pre-crisis, pre-everything. And with that, everything and anything that has ever happened in the mainstream DC universe now counts and can be used and referenced in future stories. Long story short, everything counts. Everything is canon again. The time period after death metal is Infinite Frontier, where everyone is dealing with the ramifications of the fixed timeline. Due to this being released a year ago, I won't delve too much into it, except for that it leads to the Great Darkness becoming a threat thanks to Pariah from way back. Pariah, influenced by the Great Darkness, would then try to bring to existence the Dark Infinite Multiverse, basically the multiverse from the first crisis, but in the darkness. This leads into the cleverly named event Dark Crisis, or, later on it'll be called, Dark Crisis on Infinite Earths. As a little fun fact for you guys, during MegaCon last year, I actually met the writer of Dark Crisis, Joshua Williamson. Really cool guy, really nice. He actually answered a lot of my questions about some of the stuff. The ramifications of this event lead to the heroes purging the darkness from the infinite multiverse and restoring it from the pre-crisis days. This means that everything ever made by DC at some point is probably canon, and counts at somewhere at some point. Everything. Movies, video games, TV shows, comics, everything now counts somewhere. Examples of this would be the 1966 Batman show, the Super Friends cartoon, the Superman movie from 1977, and the Batman movie from 1989, which, fun fact, apparently now both of those things take place in the same timeline. Hell, even the Superhero Girls show is now canon in its own Earth. Even the Flashpoint timeline is brought back, but that is because of Batman's efforts to save his father. This leads us to today, the dawn of the DCU. After decades of back and forth, reboots, course corrections, everything now counts in some way or another. But what does that mean for DC Comics? Well, only time will tell. But it looks like for now the Justice League is done for the time being, leaving the legacy heroes to take charge, especially Nightwing. The future of DC is always in flux. I have no idea if Dawn of DC is going to offer us their salvation or shit. But one thing I do know is that I will be attentive to find out. Thank you for watching this all the way through. I greatly appreciate your time. This video essay is actually the main reason why I came back to YouTube. I'm quite passionate about DC Comics, and I find it very interesting how they can bend and change the universe's continuity, especially in ways that pay homage and respect to what has come before. If you guys are interested, I am actually thinking of later on making this topic into a series, where I go into even further depth onto each section of DC history and the events, where I can give further context and explanation. I would even give recommendations to comics tangential to that time and story so you guys can really get the best of this universe I hold so dear. It would be like if I'm talking about the first Crisis, I'd mention about how the new Teen Titans comics at the time were of similar quality because they're written by the same people, as an example. But until then, I hope you have a great day, and I will see you later. Peace.